Well, I am Andrii Krawchuk. I teach religious studies at the University of Sudbury, and basically just general courses. My research interests are focused primarily on Ukraine, recently on Russia, and especially since the events that are being talked about in this book, the Maidan and following. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia is of paramount importance, and in my case, I like to focus on the religious dimension of these things. So the book is about, as the title says, churches in the Ukrainian crisis. In other words, it deals with the Christian communities in Ukraine that have been responding to the social, political, and military developments in Ukraine that followed the Euromaidan. Now, Euromaidan, I'm conscious that some people use that term. Other people say Maidan. Other people talk about the Ukrainian Revolution. We also hear reference to Russian intervention, Russian-Ukrainian war, and so on. So we looked at, when I say we, it's Thomas Bremer, a professor of theology at University in Germany, we are co-editors of this book. And we saw all of these different expressions, and we thought, well, really they are part of all the same process. And the most inclusive expression that we saw was emerging was the Ukrainian crisis. So we didn't coin that expression, but we just adopted it for the title of the book. And this also follows the title of a conference that Professor Bremer organized in Germany back in November of 2014. And that was the title of the conference, Churches in the Ukrainian Crisis. So from that conference in Germany, there's 10 papers, and we brought them together here into this volume. And 10 papers, we divided it up into 5 sections. And essentially, you have some basic, very fundamental questions that readers may be interested in. First of all, we begin with a historical background, then to the question of Orthodox autocephaly or ecclesiastical independence, Orthodox identity in Ukraine, interpreting the nature and the causes of the war, and looking towards the future to paths to unity and peace. So that's basically kind of the outline of what's going on here. Well, you're not just speaking to the editor here, you're speaking to one of the authors of a chapter. So I'm a little bit biased on that. I wrote about the Ukrainian faction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So obviously, to me, that is a focal point of very, very special interest. This is the largest church in Ukraine, and within that church, there is a pro-Ukrainian faction, and anybody who studied that church, for any amount of time has known about this. But they have been, keeping their silence pretty much. They never came out in public until the Maidan, until the Russian intervention, until people began to see that a Russian intervention is possible. And then all of a sudden, bishops, priests in that church, some of whom are Ukrainian, others of whom are Russian, began to stand up and say, no, this is an independent country. We are citizens of that country. And regardless whether we are Russian or regardless whether we even speak a word of Ukrainian or not, we are citizens. We don't need any intervention, and we don't want Putin here. So, I obviously became very, very interested in this. And, I've had a few trips since the conference that I'm talking about, and I've had an opportunity to interview people and to write about that. So that's my kind of entry point into it. There's a lot of very interesting contributions here, and I think when we were discussing before, you were asking, well, why even the book was being written. The first answer to that is that what the conference was about, and the idea of the conference already in 2014 was to bring together people to try to analyze and make sense of the impact of this crisis, which is not just a religious crisis, the impact of this crisis on Christian communities and how they were responding to it. So at that conference in Germany, November 2014, we decided, hey, there's really a lot of interesting material, and we should probably try to put this together into a collected volume. And the rest of the answer to your question, is the standard answer that one would give for any kind of academic book. Why do you put an academic book there? It's to share and make available with the scholarly community, but also with the public at large. In this case, findings of a group of people who have discussed together a very complex topic, and it's obvious to everybody, it's attracted global attention. And also the idea is to promote an informed discussion of issues that are, sometimes in the media or in the public discussion. This conflict has been characterized by propaganda. Propaganda going one way, propaganda going the other way. And how do you make sense of conflicting truth claims? So I think that's one of the contributions that scholarship can make, is ferret out what is going on there in somehow, hopefully, an objective fashion. I think one of the most important things that happened at the Maidan is that all of the churches, each of the churches that exist in Ukraine today, had some form of representation at the initial protests in the Maidan, whether that was official or whether that was unofficial, and just individual priests went and their bishop said, well, they're not representing us, they're just going on their own, as independent citizens. People mistakenly referred to as the Heavenly Hundred, and I'll explain what I mean. Some of them were Christians too. There were Jews, there were other people, there were Muslims, but there were also Christians and members of various churches. So again, in an unofficial way, people who belonged to them were there, and the values that they stood for, and which their churches picked up on, were Western democratic values, freedom, dignity, human rights, that sort of thing. And in fact, very opposite of the values that are being represented by the neighbor to the east, Soviet values. Okay? So in standing up for these values and for Ukrainian sovereignty, the churches of Ukraine, they witnessed for themselves unexpectedly a new kind of solidarity among themselves, a solidarity that they weren't even planning to see or that they had particularly worked on. It was just a movement in the streets on the Maidan, which later officially or unofficially joined and became part of. So at the Maidan, you had this interdenominational spirit. And that goes back to your question, what's my heart and are there positive things? I think, when you look at the Maidan, it's not just people of different ethnic groups and young people especially coming together and letting their voices be heard as one kind of Ukrainian nation, if you will. But the religious communities were there as well. So this interdenominational spirit was carried over later in the year when the conflicts began to happen, when you have refugees going all through Ukraine, and they begin to organize humanitarian aid. And they do so, you're not going to discriminate when people are suffering. You're not going to say, well, are you Catholic? We just help Catholics, So there's interdenominational work happening, and it's spontaneous and it's unexpected. It's an open question where it goes into the future, whether people continue to build on that and to see how positive and promising that is for the shape of Ukraine in the future. I don't think anybody was prepared for it. In fact, a lot of people I interviewed were saying that, in fact, one Catholic priest from Lviv told me that he says, it's the students that were in the streets that were saying, we're going to Kyiv, come with us, we need a chaplain. He had no idea what he's going to. Tell the story this way. He says, on the way and in Kyiv, day after day, we discovered what the Maidan is all about. Even in the beginnings in November of 2013, I don't think anybody knew where this Maidan would go. There would be another protest, and then after a while you'd go home. Yanukovych would still be president. So there's things that happened, on a day-to-day basis that were spontaneous, that were unexpected, and there was a lot of adaptation. And there was no program book that you could take this from. I don't think, from the West could have come in with a magic program to say, okay, here's what you do now, because it was all very spontaneous and unexpected. Okay, so it really is a crisis situation, which continues to take very different forms. But the people have been mobilized. And again, it's not just the churches, but the churches are part of this larger movement. You've heard about the volunteer movement, which did not exist. People did not even know what the word volunteer means. And now that you'd have this drastic, desperate need for assistance on the front in this. I mean, how do you fight a superpower, right? When you don't have an army, where do you begin? Food, clothing for the winter, all these kinds of things. This is like now into the third year, okay? So over time, there is this amazing adaptability people are showing, and I believe that, the churches have willy-nilly, whether they wanted to or not, they've been pushed and pulled into this by their own people. And so they are taking here and there a more proactive stance and being part of this new thing, which journalists are studying and scholars are trying to make sense of. Where is it going to go? But I think there's a lot of positive developments that are very again, this book is an attempt to analyze. It's not. The book doesn't cover to yesterday's date. The book is essentially covering the first months of the Maidan and then maybe the year, a little bit into the 2015. So it's essentially the pivotal moments and the pivotal changes that are occurring at that crucial stage, which of a large process that's that can to our own time. So it's not yesterday's news, in other words. Generally speaking, all the Orthodox are mentioned and covered and analyzed as well. The Protestants have an important role to play, and they are discussed a little bit as well. So there is an interdenominational question going on. There is a ecumenical question that is being discussed, and again, what began at the Maidan as a spontaneous coming together of people of faith, along with people of some faith or no religious affiliation, as one society, and trying to participate in raising these crucial principles that people were talking about. This, I think, is the phenomenon that is really capturing everybody's attention. So I can't give you. I mean, there's 3 Orthodox jurisdictions. So there's 3 numbers. There's 2 Catholic jurisdictions, Catholic and Greek Catholic. And then there's Baptists and Lutherans and so on. So there's a lot of Christian groups. Another dimension which this book does not go into. I'll be doing some of that myself in the future. At other religious groups, including Jews and Muslims, and of course, if you want to talk about Crimea and Donbass, you have to include them as well. Anybody who looks at so what's the religious situation in Ukraine? Well, how many churches do you have? Well, we have 3 Orthodox. What, 3 churches? What's that all about? So now with the war, it doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense to a lot of people to have an Orthodox church that is affiliated with Moscow. I mean, are these people, who are they with, right? So that is an internal question within the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. The pro-Ukrainians are saying, we're citizens of this country, so there's no question we're going to support Ukraine. The traditionalists are saying, well, we can't just break ties overnight with the Patriarchate. So they're looking at it from an ecclesiastical, traditional point of view and saying, things don't happen that way, canonically. So anathema, yes, it is anathema. But regardless of whether it's anathema, a number of parishes, they're in the dozens and probably over 100 by now. I haven't been keeping track to the last developments, but quite a number of Moscow Patriarchate parishes have said, hey, drag your heels, we're going to Kyiv, we're going to Filaret. And they're there already. Others haven't gone that far, but they've taken half a step, but it's a very significant step. I don't know if you are familiar with Orthodox liturgies and so on. There's a point at which you commemorate the head of your church. Okay? So a lot of Orthodox churches spontaneously throughout Ukraine, nobody told them, they said, we're fed up, we don't like this guy Kirill anymore, we're not going to pray for him. Nobody told them, it wasn't a plan. It's spontaneous, and it's very subversive, and it's very dangerous. I could just imagine Kirill in Moscow looking at this. Where is this going? And anybody, who's analyzing the situation, who's in the thick of it, as a bishop would be, taking responsibility not only for their own personal, for the life of their whole community, has to make some pretty delicate decisions here. And of course, the structure of the churches being what it is, it's not that a bishop acts autonomously or autocephalously just because he feels like you're part of a team. You're part of a hierarchy, okay? So there's consensus, there's decision-making, there's voting, there's all this stuff. But some people are seeing, my parishioners are leaving, or they're seeing the writing on the wall. And so some bishops are like Filaret, not of Kyiv, but Filaret of Lviv, Filaret Kucherov of the Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. 2 years ago when I interviewed him, says, I wrote to Putin in the first months of 2014, before Crimea, to say, yes, we're part of this church of Moscow, but we don't want Russian intervention. So he did that independently, writing to Putin, don't you step ground here. There's international law, and we are a sovereign country. And he's in the Russian, he's not even Ukrainian ethnically. So he's stepping out on a limb. He had positive reactions from a number of his colleagues, and no reaction from others that he cared to mention. I presume that there's a number of people in Ukraine that would disagree with him. But again, he was speaking on anybody's behalf. He was speaking from himself, which is uncharacteristic. Usually you'd expect a bishop to be towing the line. I would also hope that the enthusiasm, which might have been exaggerated in the early 90s when religion was legalized and everybody to the churches and they were bursting at the seams and when you're passing a church where there's a liturgy going on, you had people standing in the streets with amplifiers, blaring out the sermons and the choir singing. So, hopefully some of that stays. But it's no longer that 25 years down the line. The enthusiasm has waned. But I think the Maidan is a social phenomenon. Again, not a religious phenomenon, but one that the churches joined. As far as the question of taking the long perspective, I think anybody in any organization would like to think that way. We want to take a long. Why do you set up an institution? To have a long-term plan that extends beyond our lifetime. So, but whether that's to crush the opposition, that's an interesting way of putting it. In the present situation, just going back to the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't think that they can just wait it out. They're being bypassed by history, and autocephaly, unless they do crush autocephaly in Ukraine, there will be some form of Ukrainian Orthodox independence. So that is in my reading an inevitable thing as you. Becomes an independent country and stabilizes as an independent country, which hopefully continues. Hopefully, this crisis will not undermine. So too will the desire to have unity of churches in Ukraine. Now that takes the form of only one Orthodox Church. That's the model that exists in all the other Orthodox countries. Is that the only way to be Orthodox? Is it bad to have more than one jurisdiction? Do you have to have a national church, which then takes precedence over everybody else, all other religious groups and so on? I think right now the pluralism that you see in Ukraine is quite unique, and the way that people are getting together from the leadership of Orthodox churches, Catholic, Protestants, Jews, Muslims. There's this structure called the Council of Churches and Religious Organizations in Ukraine. Very few know about it, but it's been in place for almost 20 years now. And they meet regularly. They issue joint statements, and they make representations to the government with one voice. So that there's something positive about that, and there's something positive about meeting, getting together, discussing a wide range of social issues of common concern, and coming together to a consensus without converting each. You can only be Orthodox of this type, or otherwise I don't talk to you. Or if you're Jewish, I don't care when you celebrate your holidays. I mean, there's a very, very unique and I think very precious kind of pluralism that has been happening in Ukraine for 20 years, and it's going to be interesting to see where things go in the future. The book does move into the question of autocephaly, or an independent church structure. And that does not refer to the Kyiv Patriarchate, which is already independent of Moscow, and it does not to the autocephalous church, which is already, independent of Moscow as well. It refers to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So it's a question of what is the future going to be, or jurisdictions on Ukrainian soil, on Ukrainian territory, not just during the war with Russia, but after the war with Russia. What is their place? What is their role? To be fifth column, to be representatives of a hostile state. What is that? So it's an open question. I'm simplifying it. It cannot be in these simplistic terms. It has to be treated in very, very profound terms. There's a lot of interesting. There's an interesting study in the book of a parish near Kyiv where it's Moscow Patriarchate, but basically of the parishioners lie in both camps. Half the parish is supporting the Ukrainian war effort, the other half is not. And yet they maintain their identity as a Christian parish, which comes together on Sundays and has liturgies together. There are families. Not just in the Moscow Patriarchate, there are families in many different churches that stopped talking to each other, and they discovered that some members are not pro-Ukrainian. So there's a lot of. I think this would be a challenge for the near future for a lot of the churches and religious communities in Ukraine, how to restore. Let's say communities and internal solidarity when all of society has been split in this way. We like to think of everybody in Ukraine being 100% pro-Ukrainian, but that's just not the case. There's people not just in Donbass, not just in Crimea. There's people in Western territories who would rather be back together with the Soviet Union. There's a lot of discoveries in my own research. I mean, the whole story of this pro-Ukrainian faction in the Moscow Patriarchate. It's not just discovering facts, but meeting people and speaking with them. Prior to the Maidan and prior to the conflict, I didn't feel a need to speak to somebody from the Moscow Patriarchate. But that was not my subject of study. That was not something that I was, drawn to. So things change, and in Lviv, which I've been visiting for a quarter century now, I suddenly find myself walking up the street to the Russian Orthodox Cathedral and having an interview with the Bishop Filaret there. So it's not just discovering facts, it's not just discovering other people, it's discovering things in myself that I'm interested in and that I hadn't known before. I think that it's discovering what Ukraine is after when people thought, well, Ukraine is all the Ukrainian people, and everybody else who's not Ukrainian, that's not Ukraine. Well, that ended in the Maidan. That's over. Because if Jews can die and Muslims on the Maidan for Ukraine, and then if Russians, ethnic Russians who don't speak a word of Ukraine, can die on the front, that's a different kind of Ukraine you're talking about all of a sudden. So you better start writing your history books in a new way. You better start thinking about your religious communities in a new way, you know. So there's a lot of positive things, but again, it's not that somebody made a decree and said, okay, from henceforth, this is the way we'll think about ourselves. Spontaneous things, and you can forget about them very easily. You can forget about what the Maidan was all about. You can forget what it means and what transformation has taken place. You can forget why the heavenly company died. You know, I call them heavenly company because there's 100 that died. People say Nebesna Sotnya. It's the other Ukrainian word Sotnya, which means company, the military unit, which is approximately 100 soldiers. And so I prefer to say heavenly company. What do these deaths mean? What did the sacrifice? 10,000 people on the front now, right? 10,000 lives lost. What is that for? What is this war for? Okay, so it's not just about decisions or bureaucratic things or about long-term planning and we're going to crush you or not. It's like, what do you do as Christians, as people of faith, not just Christian but other faiths, in this situation to show who your faith can bring into this crisis situation where people are dying, people are suffering, people's lives are already crushed. We don't need any institutions crushing them. They're just simply crushed, right? Other people are displaced. Displacement means, they got to move to another part of Ukraine. Well, maybe after a month or so, people don't want you there anymore. So it's not that easy. And you're absolutely right. You have to have organization. You have to have certain things planned and put in place so that things can work. So spontaneous, right? It's not gonna go very far if it's spontaneous. You've got 1 million people internally displaced, right? So these are desperately important that are being faced, and it's not like somebody has a program, but the churches, which have kind of this record of thinking about very serious things and thinking about how to help people, right, are called upon to prove that they are capable to stand up to this new, unexpected, completely, unprogrammed. There's no book you can read in the West. What do you do in Ukraine? Okay, you got to follow the man that your faith gives you, and to say, okay, how are we going to work with people? And then thinking forward, how are we going to think about peace? Because this war is not going to last forever, right? So, are we going to be part of building, or are we going to be following into another pattern, which is also possible for religious communities, Christian or otherwise, right, to entrench, we were the victims, and these were the perpetrators, and they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, and we'll be neighbors, but our peace is going to be shaped by this kind of way of thinking, or is the opportunity, like you said, the flip side of crisis, the meaning of crisis in the Chinese sense, opportunity. Is that going to be something that we take to heart? And is that going to be something that we say, wait a minute, when we came to the Maidan, we did not distinguish between Russians and Ukrainians. We did not distinguish between Catholic and Orthodox. We didn't worry about whether there's one church or another. Everybody came from their own places, but they came together, and they were one. And boy, oh boy, I can tell you, when certain people in Moscow see this, that's what makes it. It's not this Lilliputian country that is fighting a superpower, doesn't have a chance in heck, but it's these kind of attitudes. That's the poison they're afraid of, because if that comes to them, it's game over. When the Maidan was beginning, I think all you could do was follow the news, right? I mean, that's all that was there. Over time, you began to get a little bit of analysis. Over time, you began to get a little bit more depth, and that's natural. But one of the other problems is that the news cycle, you have this expression now, news cycle, right? It's very short. And people, the viewers, are also, everybody suffers from attention deficit, right? So Ukraine is on the map for like a month and a half or something, right? And all of a sudden, it's no longer there. It's been 3 years now, and if you compare the coverage, when things were starting, I mean, there's no, we're not on the global radar anymore. So I think this is one of the important things that the diaspora needs to stay on. Before Ukraine was independent, there was a huge reliance on people in Ukraine, for people in the diaspora to keep Ukraine on the human rights agenda, on the social justice, on international law, and all these kinds of things, right? To keep some awareness. This international attention is no less important now when Ukraine is just precariously kind of on the precipice. We're not sure, which way things are going to go, militarily and then politically, of course. So it is very incumbent on the churches and on all organizations in the West to keep this not just in terms of information, but in terms of the truth. We come back to the matter. It's not just about journalists. It's about false news. It's also about alternative facts. And we know that there are multi-million, if not multi-billion-dollar efforts to use a certain type of news about what's going on in Ukraine. Okay, so it's a huge challenge to continue to be informed about these things, and a responsibility, I think, to speak out support in the international community. I think Ukraine as a country, really depends on a fundamental level of support from the international community. I mean, obviously, there's going to be people who don't support Ukraine, but if that's all there was, then that too would be game over. It's extremely important, and I emphasize not Orthodox Church, but all the churches that have contacts with Ukraine and have humanitarian aid going out there and so on, that they keep those lifelines of humanitarian support and moral support and active, because it is a crisis that is not just limited, to the borders of Ukraine. It's a crisis that affects all of us and potentially, other countries in Europe as well. Well, I mean, this is nothing new. Okay, I mean, you have libraries full of this type of history writing. Okay, and then on the other side, you can have this tug of war between Russians. Well, no, he was a Ukrainian-speaking patriot, or no, he was speaking. Well, actually, he spoke an old version of the language, which is probably a mix of the two. So the Kievan heritage is obviously a part of this historical tug of war, and that's not going to go away overnight. There's probably sensible ways of talking about it, which right now it's not the best climate. But to get to your question about news coverage of religion, I think I would put it together with just generally coverage of Ukraine. It's fallen off the radar to a very large extent, and anybody who wants to, the advantage here is that we have a little bit of hindsight. Okay, we're in year 3 since the conflict began, and so now this is not the very, very first book, but it's really pretty much the first book that goes into the religious question in this depth. So getting at is now you have not just little sound bites that you have to rely on from your television screen or from your YouTube video. You actually now have monograph length studies, and you have in-depth articles. And I say, these are articles that each author picked their own topic, what they were going to write about, but there's a lot of complementarity, as I mentioned, and so there's a lot of connections. If you read the book, you actually get a fairly good education about what the situation has been, what was leading up to it, and how these Christian communities began to respond. In the absence to plan things, in the absence of the opportunity to create a long-term strategy or something, this is something that's in your face all of a sudden. You just have to react. Who are you? What do you do? What do you believe in? What are your values? But it is all. It's what these young students began with, at the Maidan. They came in and they said, we're fed up with the president telling us one thing, and we elect him and he does something else. So be accountable, I think these are the last two people that need advice from me. I met Yevstrati. I asked for an interview, but I got Yevstrati, so I figured, who is this guy? What's he all about? I was very impressed. He's a very, very sharp guy. Filaret obviously is getting on in years. Last summer, I attended his church. He preached. He's still very much the preacher and speaker. I laugh because forgive me, because I think they in the Kyiv Patriarchate, with the reasons they have, with the limitations that they face, with the challenges that they face, struggling with kind of the competition, if you will. They've really made some amazing statements, and they've made really some amazing and forward-thinking positions and declarations. And you have to remember that in this time, when I study documents and when I study what some bishops are saying, this is not just somebody saying, "Oh, I think I'll say this," and let people think what that may mean. These are times when the spoken word and the written word is at the level of an act. These are times when you put your name to a signature, and when you sign your name on a particular statement, you have a stand. And should the situation change, there's a lot of people who will not be forgiven for what they say, should the situation change for the worse. There's a lot of people that are going to be in jail, they're going to be in Siberia, they're going to be just away because they're too dangerous. Everybody knows that their word indicates where they stand and what values they're going to be. But this is a crisis situation. And what I'm seeing at play is not at the forefront long-term strategies attached to fundamental principles, attached to fundamental religious principles, or principles of civil society that we people, number one. That's something that was strongly affirmed at the Maidan. We want to be with Europe, not with the East. We don't want to go back, revert back to the Soviet system. We want to have an Orthodox Church that is independent of Moscow. These right? So I think that there are people who, like Filaret and Yevstrati and others in other churches, who are very well capable to carry out long-term planning when the time comes. Maybe the time is beginning already. Maybe you're right to be asking that question now. But in that first year, I think it was more what was at play were the fundamental values where you stand. And that's why for me it was so dramatic to see inside of a church that officially is with Moscow suddenly to say, yeah, we're with Moscow, but we are patriots we're ecclesiastics of the church, but we are citizens of Ukraine, and we are loyal to Ukraine. There's no intervention that's necessary. Please, Mr. Putin, stay out. They're writing a direct letter. This is Filaret, Kucherov, and others wrote letters too. Okay, but he's the one that I spoke with. So I don't know if I'm right on that. That's a hunch that I have that it's in the early stages that it was less a matter of a well-developed coherent strategy for the long term, as opposed to a matter of identity. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are the fundamental values? What do we say? It's almost the kind of discourse that you would have at the Maidan. What are the slogans that are enunciating the principles, explaining to the people why we are here, what this is all about, and even one step further, once people were being killed, how do we explain what these people died for? What are those values that those people died for? What are we trying to not forget now? What have we learned from this? I think so. That's the elemental kind of sense. I'm guessing that in that early stage, again, maybe in year 3, you could be right. But again, the crisis is still there. They're still in crisis mode. The anti-terrorist operation is still going. We still have corruption in Ukraine, so I think it's important. Again, people from diaspora like myself and so many others, we can't really go in to that situation and tell people, here's what you should be doing. But I think there are ways to assist, and we need to be doing everything we can. Yeah, I think I have to answer this question not only with respect to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada, but again, other Orthodox and other churches in the diaspora, those especially that have connections to Ukraine, those connections. And I believe, first of all, that they are already fulfilling very important roles. I talked already about the lifelines of humanitarian support and moral support. I talked about the importance, and they're doing this, of keeping as accurately informed as possible in times when truth is really up for grabs in our world, false news and all this alternative facts. These very phrases, that didn't exist a few years ago. Now we have alternative facts. And speaking out and mobilizing wider support in the international community, support for what is under threat in Ukraine, and what is that? And what the churches there are standing up to defend, and what is that? Human dignity, the whole idea that the revolution called, liberty, and a democratic sovereign Ukraine. Very simple ideas, but standing up for that. So I think anybody who realizes that these things are under threat will be able to figure out tradition in their own communities what types of assistance may be the most appropriate. Because everybody in their communities has people who goes to Ukraine regularly, who keep in touch, who have family, who write letters or whatever, Skyping and so forth. So I think, again, not just the Orthodox, but all churches must continue working in all of these areas. And I think it's not for me really to program what shape that will be. People have been in the business of supporting Ukraine for a very long time. I think from the beginnings of churches in Canada that came from Ukraine. So it's they have plenty of expertise, and I should have thought that this is going to be open, for anybody to listen. So if I maybe stepped on some toes or mentioned the wrong people, I didn't mean to offend anyone. Again, people who read this book are gonna see things that, like, the churches did not create the Maidan. The churches joined the Maidan. It was young kids that started this. They knew that something had to give. The churches didn't know that something had to. They didn't have it in their strategic plan. They didn't have it in their vision. But later, as things began to move, it's an interesting separate study that there's a lot of interesting studies being done on day by day, like how things evolved in the Maidan. There was so little on the fly, so much of it, very extremely organic, and spontaneous. And then there came a point where, word got to the bishops and to all this, some bishops came out and some priests, this and that, and they said, we have to be here, because they said, here's what's happening in society. Here's who we are. Again, going back to what I was saying before, basic principles. We have to be there. We don't have to apologize afterwards. We just do it, because this is our faith. This is what our faith tells us to be doing. So I think, that is, when you speak that way, and when you speak the way that Filaret speaks or Yevsrati speaks, because that's not in the canons. And their only weapon is to say that's not a canonical church. They're not showing us respect. Just to go back to your thing, there are established ways of doing things, but in the present situation, even maybe in Canada, now I'm commenting on Canadian affairs, people feel that they want to be heard, and they want to be heard by their leaders, and they're not going to take no for an answer. Who do you think you are telling me you're not going to hear me? I'm, like it's almost like they're expressing it as a right that they have to be heard.